right? So when they hear about drone technology, it's most of it's probably either because DJI and the whole production world of
Right.
video and how
Yeah.
that's really come in the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, you know, and then let's say we can crunch that even more into what's going on in Eastern Europe, where then, okay, wait a minute, there's like very real modern warfare applications to this that have been either purposely or through circumstance ignored
Hmm.
and just not taken as seriously. And it's crazy because this even gets into the economy of things and how can you even go this? So, or excuse me, how can you prop up an economy in order to make drone warfare more valuable, or excuse me, less valuable, so then you're buying it, so then you're feeding into this engine, and it's just this remarkable hyper detail rabbit hole that it blows me away, to say the least. But what you're doing is, I'm shocked there's not way more people doing it. So why don't we start there and just share? I think you guys are just did a round of funding and you guys are like way oversubscribed on that. I don't know if that's completely closed off, but you know, there's obviously interest in this. So why are not as many people doing it?
Yeah. No, great lead in. I love kind of like diving into this too. There's, and I spend time reflecting on this because you reflect on like how are you differentiated, right? Like any,
Mm.
any entrepreneur, even, just from the market side, let alone like thinking how am I actually creating value and not just starting another thing that doesn't really do anything different. So yeah, a couple things. Like why? Like so, yeah. Let's zoom out for a little bit.
Mm.
Big things that have just happened within, let's just say drones. And when I say drones, I don't actually even like the term. Like, the drone it's a bio-inspired term that basically means the dumb male bees, right? So we're talking like, and to be frank, like the reason that doesn't matter anymore is because we're actually talking about intelligent agents. So drone itself is kind of a dated term, even like the phone and iPhone. Like iPhones aren't phones anymore. Like flip phones that I grew up with, they're most definitely not. So even our terminology isn't really caught up. But that's kind of a hint of like what's happened, right? So drones have been kind of the world of hobbyists for I think at least 10 years, if not 15 or more. And let's start on national security. So a couple like just factors that have happened within national security that are part of national security, like anything, identity matters here, and like how we operate matters. So there's some kind of like very specific things that probably is a parallel in history on this. Think of the creation of the U.S. Air Force. The creation of the U.S. Air Force happened in 1947. WW2 was already done, and we'd already been using air power had kind of already redefined even as early as like the end of World War One. That's when we started really like flying planes on this, and things were very different. The Air Force didn't have its own separate service for all of World War Two, and they got it at the very end of World War Two because in the face of like undeniable data, it became clear that air power was now a very real thing that we have to look at. Like it's no longer just about the soldier on the ground. We have to start thinking bigger than this. Um, we don't yet have, fast forward to where we are now, there is no drone force yet. And I don't know necessarily that we want there to be one. But what has happened is, some of the development in the U.S., I think, in Western kind of, militaries has been slow to adopt drones and better autonomous systems, in part because there hasn't been that champion for it. There's a bit of an identity thing here, right? And this actually happens in other areas of work too. But just take national security. Drones threaten the identity in a way. Like, what does it mean to be a pilot in the world of drones? What does it mean to be a sailor? What does it mean to be a soldier? When your primary job is maybe operating or maintaining a drone. What does that mean? It's very different, and I think that's actually like a very relevant factor. Is the identity piece is actually like is a very real visceral factor that sometimes slows adoption. what that has meant is that that I think definitely in the case of Ukraine was in a position where out of necessity, that's kind of the mother of invention, right? And out of necessity, a largely agro economy said we have to find the critical path to achieving parity to try and defend ourselves. And we don't have time to think about identities and feelings, to be really frank. And that forced them to an adoption of the kind of cutting edge, the best optimization of low cost and something that works. That then is something the whole world's kind of seen, right? So over the last since 2022 through now, we've finally seen like what the power of even just very rudimentary drones can do, and how it has this kind of asymmetric impact to where you can achieve things that it used to take fully trained pilots and full big air forces or big ground forces or even like beyond line of sight weapons, all this stuff that very, very expensive. Very few folks could even afford to have anything like this. And all of a sudden, it's in the hands of a hobbyist who can buy a few parts that were intended for the drone racing league. They can assemble them themselves, literally in their garage, go fly something, duct tape on some kind of explosive or semtech, and all of a sudden you have something that is 100x cheaper and kind of really like changes all kinds of paradigms there. So that I think is one kind of like big factor for what's happened. The other like two kind of things I would just throw to say, or just if we was to zoom out on this, is there's been two kind of other technology things have happened kind of recently, right? And we are living, I think, in an age where there's an ever increasing, almost to the nth degree rate of improvement. And that is in multi-agent autonomy. That's in generative AI. It's also in the materials science that goes into producing the physical world manifestations of robotics and agents. Those two things kind of combined have created an environment where now there's opportunities for all kinds of people to realize and to actualize all kinds of autonomous agents, drones, and intelligent robotics. And that's in all kinds of domains. That's in low Earth orbit. That's in the air. That's at sea. That's in subsurface. That's at land. That's at the humanoid. That's, could be in your house. Like it's all of those. So those three things of like kind of slow identity factors, plus the massive improvements in both the intelligence and the compute and the availability of like new and kind of other materials. You put all those things together, and that's really kind of changed how I think we have to think about national security, really kind of at a fundamental level.
So then how do you want to approach this problem, right? So in terms of like that value proposition, backing up a bit, which I probably should have started with, but it is what it is. Tell me about the round of funding you guys just did, what you guys are trying to do, and how you're trying what I'm hearing and gathering and from our previous conversation is kind of where robotics and information meets, right? One was out competing the other for so long, and now finally you have more of the engineering space, the earth sciences and robotics catching up to that information age. So now that they're both kind of, let's say, maturing as industries, and you're now seeing the humanoid side of things coming out, you're now seeing a lot of tests with the US Air Force and autonomous planes. They're winning 100% of the time, which is kind of where engineering robotics meets information. Where those are now meeting, you're basically trying to bring scale to that, because it's one thing to have an F-35 that's autonomous, that's worth whatever number, probably in the billions it takes to either get there, or then, $100 million aircraft. That's not, and I think that's what happened with the Houthis, out in the Middle East. It's like they're shooting down with like $1 million rocket, and it's $100 million airplanes and drones, and you're like, wait a minute, something's off here.
Yep.
So what you guys are trying to do is meet in the middle there. Now that they've both matured and go, okay, wait a minute, there's a very real blue ocean here, right? Both in the economic standpoint, but also national security of like, this is a problem that must be solved. So tell me more about like what you guys are doing, about what you guys want to do, and what the next 3 to 5 years are, and then I want to dive into why right after.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So what we did is look and say what one. I think the term autonomy has probably become it's almost become like useless. Like it just 'cause folks are not on the same page when they're talking about what do we even mean by that. We tried to do this levels of autonomy. That and to their credit, Tesla's kind of trying to push this like nomenclature of like level 4 versus level 5 autonomy. What does this mean? But I think we're largely we don't really understanding what we're talking about. So what we said is like, okay, I believe a couple core convictions. I believe that this is the decade of robotics from 25 to 2035. And we also believe that we need to create intelligent robotics that can utilize kind of like existing sensors and existing capabilities, not trying to produce ever more sophisticated kind of unique sensors to allow them to do more important things. So what we really found is we said let's drill down autonomy to something like tangible and meaningful. Like what do we mean by this? We drilled it down to Techstars uses this kind of nomenclature of the buckets of pain points for a customer, and I like this kind of like approach. So we said, what's the bucket 5 pain point within autonomy? Bucket 5 being like, this is the pain point that a customer or an end user, or a national security professional feels, and it's like a knife in the ribs. Like this is the one they will immediately throw money at to say, save me. This isn't like the nice to have feature. This isn't like theoretical. This is like, what is the problem like right now? And kind of cage it from there. So what we found is really, you drill autonomy down, it's about localization, as in understanding where I am. And then the key part of that was, how do I do that in a GPS denied or signals jammed, unreliable signals environment? So, because if you can imagine for a second, the way most, really every drone and robotic system is operating, it's like they have this ever expanding amount of invisible Pinocchio strings that have to be there for them to operate. They have to have these good ones from geosynchronous orbit. And if they lose one of these strings, they can't operate anymore. They have to have these strings from somewhere on the ground that's running up to them. If they lose that, they can't operate anymore. Often they have to have other ones between units themselves. And if they lose that, they get confused and they can't operate anymore. How do we cut the strings to then allow these units to truly operate autonomously without a human babysitting the whole time? Like that's really kind of the key. What we found is like most folks that were trying to, and this is still true, most approaches for this were some kind of like expensive hardware solution: quantum ion views, atomic clocks, magnometers, new constellations, low Earth orbit, some kind of LiDAR, all this bolt-on stuff. And what that it takes, like in the drone space, that takes a $2,000 drone, turns into a $50,000 drone every time. Really, you still have to integrate new software in it, and we're heading down the road of like creating this drone and robotic system that's like a blob of a million eyeballs with no brain. It's like, this is not the way we're going to defend the U.S. This is not the way to do this. So our approach is like, what if I take kind of this agent, train it in a simulator using machine learning and reinforcement learning, put a genetic goal setting at the end so that it knows how to navigate, it knows how to do kind of sim to real conversion, all techniques that we can use, and then build that into something open and modular. Not vendor lock it and say it only works with this hardware, only works with this protocol, and try and box in the customer this way, whether that customer being the government or a commercial customer. And instead built it like, works with all of NVIDIA's products, work with all the Raspberry Pi products, and can sit on top of the software that's already on a drone or a weapon or another robotic system. And then if it loses GPS or it gets spoofed or jammed or something happens to it, our simulation then can tell it where it is, provide that localization, and it can perform that option. So the net result is that you no longer need these strings, whether that's from cold start, en route, or even the terminal phase of operations. And that could be for a drone as a weapon or a munition that's operating like towards an actual target. It could also be the same drone that's coming to your house with a delivery package, and that it has to. We want that delivery package to go on your front door, not on the neighbor's door. How do we do this kind of stuff without being reliant on these signals environments that are very, very unreliable, easily jammed, easily disturbed. So that's what we've been building. I've had great traction both on the defense side and the commercial side. We finishing up our fundraise now, and excited to kind of go to market, do live flight testings, and kind of move out.
So truly autonomous then.
Yeah,
True.
that's how I think of autonomy. Exactly. I think we think of autonomy as like cut those Pinocchio strings that are up here, that are this way, and let it operate. And then the other like key part of it though, we by autonomy, this actually matters. Like this is a little like philosophical, but it matters, right? Do we want to live in a world where humans have no part of deciding lethal operations within a military?
Probably not.
Probably not, is what I would say, and I would use those same words. Probably not, right? But I think probably not. So then the question becomes for autonomy: where do we put the human? Does the human need to be in the cockpit anymore? Does the human need to be pulling the trigger for a missile, like actually rifling it? Or is the human a little bit farther back? Where in the flow chain of that events does the human want to exist? We put a lot of time into this, and just based on my background, flying AC-130 gunships and the things I did in the Air Force, this matters a lot, like of where you put that human. So we think we put the human in the training environment, and then that human's involved with a type of policy-based goal setting for those agents that it's training. What that does is a couple things. One, it allows the human to kind of manage this multi-agent battalion or squadron is really what you're doing. And then we're also, and there's some real interesting kind of MIT research, that we've seen on this, that we've also seen that this is a way to capitalize the advantages of human crystallized intelligence with what you'd call like vertical machine intelligence. And you put these together and you come with some really unique kind of outcomes. We do that in a simulator environment where the human can be involved with, hey, this is the bounds of what I want you to accomplish. And the machine then determines autonomously how to accomplish these bounds. That then becomes transparent for the human. And the important thing about this is then the human has a confidence level of what that machine is going to do in an autonomous situation. So I know if it gets to the target area and it's not exactly what we thought, then I have an idea, a concept of what those bounds look like. And the way we think about that is much like a hurricane forecast, where you see the different models and you see kind of the spaghetti noodles of where that hurricane will impact. It still is useful. You don't know exactly where that hurricane is going to impact, but it does give you as the human, it gives you very useful information because you understand kind of the bounds of where it could be, right? And we see that as kind of a key part of human machine teaming that's done in that simulated environment, which is then actualized in the real world. And so that what we see there is, I think that's the optimized way for autonomy, so that the humans are no longer holding back the speed of decision making, which is a benefit for true autonomy, but the human's still involved with it, and we can capitalize on kind of the human's intent. The parallel of this is chess. The chess right now is just a fascinating kind of case study on this. So, we started in kind of the I think early '90s, and by like the early '90s into the late 2000s is when IBM started making its first chess supercomputer, and it was playing against these grandmasters. And it took a while. The humans were beating it. Then finally, the computer won, and it barely won. And then over the year, from somewhere around 2000 to like 2010, the machine started dominating, and they had to like reset kind of like calibrations. And at this point, the machine basically always won. Well, then they opened up a new kind of category, and this is still there today. It's the open category, where it's anything's allowed. And what we've found is the dominant teams on this one are humans and machines that are teamed. And they are beating the machine-only chess masters and the human-only grandmasters. They were dominating them to the point where they had to create a separate division for them. And the ones that have emerged as kind of like the best and optimal chess player like in the world is usually when it's a 2 to 4 humans combined with like 2 to 4 machine agents that are running this kind of like playbook and iterative process. And that is beating the IBM machines. It's also beating the grandmasters in chess. And what's really interesting is that often the humans involved in that scenario, they're not the best chess players in the world. Many of them are not even ranked. They're, maybe have like a year of chess under their belt. And then they're going up against human grandmasters with these kind of machine-enabled agents and dominating them. That's kind of a parallel of how I see where we want to take warfare to ultimately create the most capable way of doing national security.
Mm. And you see this is quite important. The part of the reason why I say probably not is because the answer is not no, and it's definitely not yes. Meaning, like, I don't want humans to have no input, like zero input, because then, I mean, that's Skynet, right? Like, we don't want Skynet. That's not the goal here, right? But at the same time, we don't want to be held back, because that's why we talked about this a little bit, but most AI is just automation rebranded. That's not what you guys are doing. You guys are doing true AI, local, no server connections, no attachments, no strings, no
Right.
data connections, no API keys, right? No like nothing. So how do you keep the safeguards then within it? Because it sounds to me like I don't want to say programming it, ignore the nomenclature, but you're programming it and then breaking those links so that and then deploying it so that it can do what it's been ordered. Or
Yeah. No, it's a very important way of doing it. Think of it this way: we see the simulator node, which is not completely dissimilar from like advanced gaming. We see the simulator node as this is the node where there's the convergence of both human learning and machine learning. Both will learn as they iterate in this one. And then what's happened is you're training the agents to operate in a way that that meets these kind of human defined goals. But the reality is they'll also be machine defined goals. That then you operate. By doing that, that's how I think, because I agree with you on the probably not, and that's the same answer I would give is probably not. That's how we get to a point of maximally utilizing the capability of agentic software with, it's not only safeguards, it's actually higher performance. So I believe, back to the chess analogy, I believe that our software approach will dominate against another potentially Chinese software or the other US-based autonomy software, that the human won't be in the loop at all. I believe those dynamic situations that crystallized intelligence, which is kind of a unique human capability, I believe that will actually give us better advantages in those situations. So there's definitely the point of like, hey, we don't want Skynet, we don't want there's a safety algorithm in there. But I also flip it and say we are holding back our own performance if we are taking human training out of the loop completely and it's pure machines. So what it means is we just have to rethink how we do both human learning and machine learning. And I think, again, we're seeing parallels of this. The chess example is one parallel. We're seeing there's some brand new research on this, which I don't think surprises anyone, is that we're seeing even for young students, like primary school students, that are being taught by kind of an iterative generative AI, type chat interface, they're producing better results than some of the best private schools in the world. And both human and machine learning. What's happening is both human and machine learning is happening, and we're cycling at this very fast. So if you think back to John Boyd's, like the concept of OODA loop, which is kind of an Air Force like core thing of observe, orient, decide, act. Observe, orient, decide, act. And the basic, old school kind of fighter to fighter pilot way of thinking is the faster you do that circle of observe, orient, decide, act, that's who wins the dogfight. That's kind of like the basic thinking. I think that's still actually accurate. That has to be synthesized between both humans and machines. So I think it's not just about safety. I think actually performance is better if we find the way to integrate the humans in. That will mean we have to rethink how we do human learning as well. Like, it means a complete rethinking of this. And traditional systems are not going to work on this. The bolt-on approach will not work. But if they're integrated and synthesized, I think you will get a better, like to the nth degree, better performance within those autonomous agents as well.
You mentioned the parallel of the gaming industry. What increases in gaming has that parallel?
Yeah, one of it's just like a practical one is that I mean the reason that we have what we have with NVIDIA and the GPU clusters became kind of the engine for OpenAI is because gamers wanted better graphic processing units. I mean that's what happened. So the gamers have pushed GPUs, and then we found that GPUs could be optimized to do transformer calculations, and then that was kind of the real click, right? Back in 2017 when Word to Vec came out first, and we said, well, okay, we can actually use vector math on the human language, and we can put that onto a GPU cluster, and then we can build a language model. And that was a kind of a key invention. That invention is on the same level as electricity, frankly. When 100 years from now, we will teach that in our history books that unlocked that GPUs plus Word to Vec plus doing transformers in a GPU cluster unlocked a way of doing language models that is on the same parallel as electricity. That has powered where we're at today. So what I think the most interesting innovations are continuing to see how that kind of trajectory also plays into the advances that trajectory has enabled within material sciences, within other real physical sciences, within manufacturing, within robotics itself, and then harnessing those two kind of, and sometimes more than two, tidal waves together and riding that wave, if you will, to use kind of a investor terminology. I think is where you get some really compelling outcomes.
So you see this then as the linchpin of all of future warfare.
Yeah, I do see that, and I think there's evidence for this. Some of the evidence being you quoted some of them is the price overmatch between there's a real problem when we are spending $200,000 to $400,000 an hour to operate crewed, and by crewed I mean CREWED, crewed F-15 Strike Eagles to shoot down $1,000 drones. Like that is not sustainable. The launch, this was last spring, that Tehran did into Israel of a drone swarm, a very crude drone swarm. These are powered literally with diesel engines, right? That cost them roughly $92 million US dollars. It cost Israel with the Iron Dome in US dollars in a 24-hour period, 1.4 billion to defend against.
Okay, wait a minute. So a game of attrition can bring down an empire alone from this. Yeah. I think because we are on fiat and have been on fiat for so long, people are a little more disconnected to what you're saying than they probably should be. And throughout history, they wouldn't be allowed, like through reality, the scope of reality in economic terms, they wouldn't have been allowed to be this disconnected to what you just said. So can you say what you just said in another way?
Yeah.
Or like reword that?
Yeah, it's important, right? So we have a system right now for multiple reasons. Financial policy is definitely part of this. It's also just it's the nature of just what happened. The MBAs would call this the S curve, and that is like once you've ridden an S curve up, which you could say the U.S. has done and our allies have, and you've built up a certain structure, a certain G&A, a certain kind of economic per unit economics. It's very hard to go back down. It's almost impossible actually to go back down. That's just the nature of business actually. So that's another factor that's happening. When you combine that with all kinds of economic policies, what we've been in a situation where we are to defend against the a type of like high unit drone and or autonomous agent attack. It often will cost, and the evidence was from that attack from Tehran into Tel Aviv. I think that's a perfect case study of this. It will cost on the order of sometimes 100x just to defend against that. That doesn't take long to extrapolate that out. And let's just assume currencies were pegged and there's no currency configuration of this at all, and just sanitize that part of this analysis as like a random control trial way of thinking about this. You sanitize that out, it would not take long to effectively bankrupt all kinds of entities with drone swarms that are going to be shot down, but that you're going to force them to spend ever more money on defending against it. So then what you do, you put an enemy in a position where they're now having to cannibalize their own economic prosperity into defending against these ever more increasing, really cheap but explosive type weapon systems that can threaten them, anywhere. And it turns into kind of a mass on this. And that, because of that turning into that kind of mass, that necessitates what I believe we're trying to do, which is kind of to harken back to Thomas Kuhn, like a structure of scientific revolution. Like, it necessitates riding that S-curve back down. So what we're building is a way to compete with a brand new S-curve that we can compete, and we can actually financially match and even beat that. We could even beat that. But it means that, and it really means that, like, it's the max performing of the term disruptive to do this. So it means a rethinking of all of the existing systems that we have. And by that, I mean using better software so that they can do much more advanced things without having to bolt on new hardware, without having to make it more expensive. Because by doing this, we're actually kind of in a point where we're playing into that kind of economic asymmetry. And this has happened in the GPS denied space for a while. So there's been within Department of Defense, like there's a whole camp of assured PNT, positioning, navigation, and timing. And this assured PNT is, technical efforts, deep tech technical efforts to try and keep GPS and these strings that we talked about, to keep them working in the space of electronic warfare and simple jamming and solar flares and kind of, this whole architecture. The problem is, what it's done is it plays into that economic piece, and it just keeps making that Tehran's drones versus the Iron Dome. It keeps making that more and more asymmetric, and you keep making this more and more expensive. This is actually a risk. This is a very real risk of a project I definitely support. And I think we're calling it, or at least I've heard it called, the Golden Dome, which is a version of that within the U.S. 100% something we need to do. We need to do it very, very well. But runaway cost and thinking about it this way could actually make it worse. It could actually make this situation worse. So we have to really think about how we do this. And that I believe in any kind of capitalist kind of based economy, this is why startups matter. Because startups can come in with a new business model and a new tech. They can start at the bottom of this S-curve. They can still be profitable, producing brand new disruptive kind of technologies. And that's kind of the unique epoch of where I think we're at, which is ultimately why I'm doing what we're doing.
It's crazy because I think the same way you described 100 years from now, they'll look at large language models and think back to how pivotal that was. I actually think the Eastern Europe situation and then the Gaza-Israel situation will also be one of those, less for the events and much more, not to downplay, but less for the events and much more the mass realization within all things warfare, where people realized, okay, the bomb can't just blow up.
Yeah.
Because there's a cost. Like I said, we lived in this world since the late 60s where we've been able to disconnect ourselves so profoundly that has never, no nation and no time in history have they ever really been able to do that. So I just finished a book, really, really solid book called The House of Morgan. And it just followed the rise of not just JP Morgan, like the giant, but his father, where it came from, his son, Jack, all the way up. And you see the reality behind, they actually had locations throughout Britain and the United States, and they were like much more, I would say, globalist before that term was a thing, before World War One, right? And then World War One comes, and you're talking about like these banks were funding governments because governments had no choice, right? And that's why J.P. Morgan was such a giant. Is like he would bail out, I think 4 separate times, the city of New York. Now that concept, right? That one city, being able to bail them out, not because you're some all-encompassing puppet master bank, but the money had to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
It couldn't just be printed. And we have disconnected ourselves so much from this, and then apply that to a blank check of the military, right? You go, oh, wait a minute. There is a reality behind this. Defense can't cost 100 times,
Yeah.
right? Because it won't last forever. That expression, kicking the can down the road, like the road ends eventually. And I think people woke up to the fact that it might end a little faster than they realized. The math is no longer mathing, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned something though in there that I do want to talk about, because I've done contracting on Kadena Air Base and Camp Foster out in Okinawa quite a bit. We talked a little bit about that. I actually just moved back to Nashville. So I've seen it. I've been able to see kind of both sides of the fence there. I'm trying to think of how to put this. I mean, obviously the threat of China is very real, and the rise of China is very real, but it's also, relatively speaking, orchestrated. But you have these two different sides of things, meaning they don't see a military or commercial side. Like, it's integrated. Now, they might utilize them in different ways, but it's the same arm, right? Or excuse me, it's two different arms of the same controller, whatever, I'm using that expression wrong. Whereas we are significantly more separated in the West, right? So how can, when you talk about like gaming and how the gamers and the capitalist system kind of drove that, element of things, there is no right answer, and this is the literal world dominating $1 trillion question. But how do you see innovation and the capitalist model being able to compete with, that model that they have over in the East?
Yeah, there was a couple kind of just first kind of, I don't know if I'd say first principles thing, but like a couple, like, because this is a very important question. One, a general principle, and this principle has always been true, but it's become massively more complicated, and that is that any area of human activity that can be monetized will be weaponized. So this is important to kind of understand this. Any area that can be monetized can be weaponized. We have many more, and this from a purely kind of military perspective, we have many more domains now than we even did decades ago, right? There's contests that are happening in really all across the areas of human activity. So there was an old kind of moniker that I still kind of like, and it's useful, but it just shows us that was, I think, a lot of the international relations theory types would call DIME, and the DIME was the instruments of power. The M being military, the E being economic. Those things, just like Clausewitz even kind of wrote about, right? Those things all are instruments of power, and war is just Clausewitz, right? War is just a continuation of politics by other means. That means all of those efforts are all part of kind of like a competition, if you will. That's a factor. That has now happened well more than just 4 domains. There's all kinds of new domains. And what's happening is that as generative AI and autonomy creates new points of leverage, these domains interact with each other in these kind of very unpredictable ways for us to understand. That's compounded also by the increasing complexity of our international relations from all kinds of reasons, whether that's economic, whether it's military. Like it's hard to even express how much more complicated our connections are. And a great way to look at this sometimes, just look at, like, if you were to just take a global map and look at where air traffic goes around the globe, it gives you a sense of, like, okay, there's actually a lot more ties here between this area than maybe I thought there was. And then tie it to where the undersea cables are, and then tie it to where maritime traffic is, and then tie it to where the satellites are. And it gets very, very complicated to where, in some cases, it's almost like the oil market that has become, almost so complicated that no single person really understands it. Like, people think they do, but they don't actually understand, like, the true levers anymore. So that complexity is a very kind of real factor, I think. Complexity also goes to the human element, which is fear, and we always fear what we don't have a really good grasp on, right? So this is also a factor in how nations react to each other, and I think that's both from the U.S. to the CCP and CCP from the U.S. To your point earlier about within CCP, like, how do they think about really any activity? A couple of things probably worth drawing out is a much longer time horizon. This is kind of challenging, I think, for the Western mindset in general. And this is commentary, right? So useful for just that level of analysis, but difficult for most Americans or Westerners to think beyond even like 10 years. And most think barely beyond a year. You take kind of a different mental model when you think of in hundreds of years. And that, I think, is important for us to at least allocentrically acknowledge that is the thinking that goes in, that largely anything within China, right? That's probably one kind of like primary difference. Your point earlier of like everything being dual use, well, that gets easier to understand when you start thinking in these long time horizons. When you think in very short time horizons, you think, oh, I'm going to spend money, I'm going to do something of this, and it's going to be for this military effort. And then we're going to stop that, and we're going to do something, and spend money, invest, and produce something for this commercial effort. When you're thinking at much, much longer, like macro temporal ranges, then you start to see how they all kind of like intersect. And this is definitely how I think this is probably an underappreciated way, but how we have to start really thinking about the Communist Chinese Party and what is happening in that area. And that is that all of the efforts they've done and the commercial success they've had, whether it's in drones, which is DJI drones, or market dominance within the commercial world, almost complete market dominance, right? They've actually exited most U.S. commercial grade or consumer grade drones. They've basically exited the market because DJI has just dominated that. This is true for other kind of manufacturing, right? Within manufacturing itself, just production of anything in the kind of Guangzhou area and other areas there. You have 194 million full-time employed, people within the CCP producing real things. The U.S. equivalent of that is 11.49 million people doing it. That's the scale of just how much production is happening. What's also happening, right? And we talked about this, DIME, it's all intersected, right? Diplomatic efforts, information efforts, military efforts, economic efforts, it's all intersected. What's also happening, this is again in the fact category, that you have the Chinese, like last I saw, they have $3.26 trillion of U.S. currency held in their monetary banks, within their version of the Fed. By holding this kind of currency, it absolutely devalues it, which is why, in my assessment, they've done currency manipulation. By doing currency manipulation, that made it all that much easier for U.S. dollars to buy Chinese goods, which made it advantageous over the last 20 years to ship all kinds of offshoring of U.S. production, like the iPhone and everything else, and actually do that production in CCP, in Guangzhou mostly. that's all being underpinned by these two kind of different factors that also gives them tremendous capacity in a world where mass volumes of drone swarms all of a sudden have military significance that's nearly the same power of like the Manhattan Project. And it may not have been intended 20 years ago. Maybe that was, maybe it wasn't. Doesn't actually really matter. Doesn't really matter. It's where we are now. So we're in that kind of situation where their entire DJI product lines and other advanced manufacturing lines also give them this kind of like national production kind of capacity. And as they've kind of redone their entire military towards being a drone force, and they've recognized the two, as you pointed out, like the Ukraine and or Gaza will probably be known as the first drone wars, right? The history books will look at that. They've recognized that. And because of they don't have as long of a trenched kind of military base, industrial base, it's been easy for them to ride, create new S curves and ride down the S curves they have, so they can pivot faster towards mass production of autonomous systems. And that is all of those things together in isolation. Those, each one of those is like mildly interesting. When you put them together, that's the kind of picture, and I think the security environment that we're actually entering into. And you're in a position there where now we're pivoting to creating and we must do this. We're pivoting to creating a military that can deter any kind of conflict with CCP. How do you do that? The how to doing that is very, very different in 2025 than even how we thought it was in 2015. So it's put kind of a massive imperative on changing how we think of our own manufacturing base, how we think of the utilization of autonomy, how we think of our own employment base, how we think of our own financial policy and economic policies, because all of that has went into building up this capacity now that is the number one thing that we have to kind of deter against. All of which was kind of a slow creep that was happening, and there's all kinds of reasons that we probably got to the position that we're in. But it's kind of important now, some ways we think about it is that drone and the drone wars in Ukraine and Gaza, I think, showed us the power of it. The kind of so some geopolitical reasons that have kind of like really crescendoed what I think has been happening kind of slowly for years, and now in a position where we have to start taking kind of like dramatic action to do that. How do you do that? That's been one of the things we see is like new startups bringing new technology quickly so that we can capitalize on the current environment and the current kind of technology we have now. That becomes really like a national imperative.
So big picture here, right? And with this innovation, it is not a secret that listen, Peter Thiel's 0 to 1, right? Like there's a reason why he wrote that. There's a reason why he's been saying what he's been saying. Like it's not much of a secret that on every front, for one reason or another, and everyone can point a finger in a different direction, but the innovation has stagnated, and that's not just in drones. That's not like, it would be one thing if we had the innovation in an area and then the last couple years happened and everyone said, oh, wait, we're building in the wrong spot. And to a degree, that's kind of happened. But it's totally different to say the building is just slowing. Not like a little bit, like significantly, right? Why do you see that the building has just stopped? When I say that, I don't necessarily mean that in just regulated industries, meaning like in the biomedical industry, which I have a little bit of an experience in. That's very clear. There's way over-regulation. There is way too much corporate and regulatory tides, and I think we're seeing that now in the political landscape. Don't need to go down that road, but just generally speaking, with those startups that you're talking about, bringing this new technology, like where is it? What's going on with that?
Yeah. These are not the only factors. In my mind, there's probably three factors that are worth calling out. And all of them, and this is why these things happen, right? all of them were good qualities that helped us at one point, and times have changed. So the first one I would say is that we have not had significant acquisition reform since Robert McNamara put out
When you
PPA.
say you mean mergers and acquisitions?
No, I mean how and thanks for clarifying that, how the government acquires and
Got it.
procures and develops technology. That has not changed fundamentally in many decades. It was a good process that he brought in. I'm convinced if he saw what we were doing right now, he would roll over in his grave and be like, I cannot believe you guys are still using this. I'm very convinced that would happen. When he brought it in, it was a useful, commercial-based way of thinking of budgeting and holding companies accountable. What's happened now is we've done that so long that we have this kind of like regulated oligopoly at the top, and they're great primes, great, and they do some great things, but it's made it very difficult for massive innovations to kind of happen. And they have, like any publicly traded company, they have return to their shareholder that has to happen. So that has been that's one of the number one things that needs to happen, like is reform, and I'm a big proponent of this, and I am very heartened by this. We are moving out quite well on this. So the new SecDef put out guidance on this for software, which is actually really interesting, and it's called SWP authorities, and they were actually written years ago. I think during President Trump's first term. But it really, like a lot of new laws, it didn't get a lot of attention. And I think contracting officers and other folks just didn't get, any real education on this. And he has put out a memo, it was only a couple of weeks ago, that basically told the entire DoD, you will use these authorities to procure really good software from software companies. That's the bottom line of what this is. And it really speeds this. So I'm actually quite heartened by this. I see a parallel to when Ash Carter, and I think he was really just phenomenal for doing this, when Ash Carter stood up DIU. So Ash Carter stood up Defense Innovation Unit, and when he stood this up, the basic premise was we're going to take other transaction authority, OTA, and we're going to massively accelerate our innovation. And they actually did some really good stuff and continue to do some really, really cutting edge work. OTA authorities, which are non-FAR based authorities, this gets into acquisition regulations again, but OTA authorities they had been around for decades. No one had ever used them this way. So I see a parallel within software, which ultimately leads to AI and autonomy, which I'm very heartened by. So I think we actually are starting to recognize this. I do believe congressional action needs to happen on this, though, within the federal acquisition space. And I think major reform needs to happen in how we build military capability. And that's one of the major ones. A couple other, two other kind of, things I think that are just maybe more cultural observations that I'll make just from my 20 years in the Air Force. One, we built up a certain way of doing American warfare from Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and a few other places, shortly after 9/11, all the way through COVID and the pullout of Afghanistan. That was an epoch. That was a 20-year epoch. And we built up a way of warfare that was tactically just overwhelming. But I think even the casual observer would look back and say there were some real strategic problems with how we did that. Some real strategic problems. The tactical way to success, that sometimes success can be your biggest obstacle to overcome in a new environment. We will have to intentionally do things differently that worked very well in that environment. And that is sometimes culturally for any organization, that's just tough to do. When you knew something worked, you did it for 20 years a certain way at a tactical level, and now you got to basically throw that all away and start with something new. That's jarring, and that's hard to do. So that's something that I think there's a cultural leadership actually is kind of what needs to overcome that. And again, I'm heartened by this, but directionally that's really a major thing that needs to happen. The other one being, and this is an overall kind of macroeconomic way of thinking. And I think this is just an understanding of how capitalism works at a kind of a fundamental level. I think this is probably something we need to kind of revive, and that is that capitalism, like I believe it was Winston Churchill said, it's a terrible system, but it's better than any other alternative. I think it was something along these lines. And there's understanding that it also is somewhat fragile and can be corrupted by malign actors. So, capitalism works well as long as people are honest about the accounting and what's on their books. Does anybody think that China actually only spent $5 million on DeepSeek? I mean, really? Like, does anybody really believe that? No. So, and if you do, honestly, then you're not understanding like what's really happening here.
Yeah, you don't know the game that they're playing.
You don't know the game they're playing.
Yeah.
That's happening in many different ways there. So being clear-eyed and understanding like, okay, maybe not everybody's playing by the same rules that we're playing by. Just an acknowledgement of that. And those two other factors, I think, is a lot of like kind of how we got there. I also believe that's understanding that is how we can kind of move forward to, meet these kind of new challenges.
What do you see as some of those new challenges then?
Well, yeah, we're in a position where one of, if not the primary way to achieve national power is through massive amounts of autonomous low-cost agents.
So we got to figure drone swarms.
Drone swarms.
Land, sea, or air.
Land, sea, air, orbit, subsurface, ground, all of it. How do we get there? So how do we get there? That is and how do we play catch up with, again, just take the scale, 11.49 million people in just hardware manufacturing, because hardware is a factor here, versus 194 million over in China. We also have very good evidence of IP theft from anything that we are producing in the U.S. So if there's a software type breakthrough, what's happened, and DeepSeek I think is pretty evidently influenced by this, that even when the U.S. is making these breakthroughs, that IP is getting stolen and being then produced by a company that can actually materialize it quickly, and we don't have those spaces. So one is that massive investment needs to go into this area, like massive public-private investment. And I believe it needs to be both, needs to go into this area. Two, what also needs to happen is we need to clean up the cap tables on a lot of companies. There's a whole line of, it gives it instruments of national power, and it has to do with finances, right? And there's some great and I think unsung heroes within the U.S. government that did tremendous work to defeat ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other networks through finances alone. And this is often unsung. I don't think people really realize just how instrumental some of these efforts were. We need to start thinking through this lens. And we need to be very careful where the financial interests are. And there's kind of a rebalancing and a disentanglement that probably needs to start happening. And it will probably be uncomfortable at first. It will probably be uncomfortable. This needs to happen though, because finances are influence, and that's really how this kind of that will be part of this kind of untangling. So I think sunlight's the best disinfectant. I think some sunlight is what's needed in a lot of this kind of thinking. I mean, there's to be example, like one of the most prestigious VC firms, Sequoia, was called out by Congress, a year and a half ago, for all of the dark Beijing money that they had as part of their limited partners. And that's just open source, right? It's likely a lot worse than that. So this is something we have to start kind of looking at, about understanding, like, as the innovation that we are spurning, to making sure we're not saddling it right from the beginning, and that it's not actually serving the ends that we need it to. So there's some congressional work to happen, which I talked about earlier, within planning, programming, budgeting, execution within DoD, that I think will actually matriculate into the dual use world as well. And then that will get us back to, I don't think we're ever going to have, nor do we necessarily want, a model where the public sector does all the innovation and then it goes to commercial. I think we can do these simultaneously. But hand in hand, I think is actually where we could really accelerate this, both for our own prosperity and for our own peace. So some congressional work needs to happen with how we do, how we procure within DoD that will have transfer value into our, basic prosperity for these systems and robotics to, improve our quality of life, which we absolutely want. That has to happen. Understanding the money and getting very serious about that, very clear-eyed about that, I think needs to happen. And that probably goes into our own fiscal policy and the ways kind of I think we think about what the dollar actually does and how that matters for our own national security. There's definitely some work to be done, in that area. And then, there's areas that have to happen for hardware manufacturing as well. And I think the other one, and this is kind of a small point, but I think it actually matters a lot. The American way of our entire economy, and I think this is a strength, right? That we are not a centralized area, right? We are decentralized, empowered founders and investors and teams that are builders, and I think we're actually builders at heart that want to build things. I think we have to really start rewarding and encouraging the builders that integrate with other builders. So we have to really fight any kind of monopolistic tendencies early on this. And that's done both the kind of investment side that is probably done on a policy side. That's done, with the Department of Commerce side, even has to really look at this. So I believe the EU is largely going down the wrong path on this when they talk about regulating AI safety. And instead, what they're probably doing is preventing themselves from ever actually innovating in this world. But the converse could happen as well. And we have to be very careful that we don't set up an environment where only large corporations that are trying to do one ring to rule them all end up all doing the autonomy or AI or hardware production. We will be much, much, much more powerful, and we will get there much faster with a kind of robust, decentralized, and distributed economy, which ultimately harnesses, really deep U.S. core values and I think our strengths. So in other words, a Control-C, Control-V from Guangzhou into the U.S. is not the right way. That's not the winning option.
I think you're really seeing that politically, happen over the last, I'd say 4 years or so. The people really speaking about not wanting to copy and paste what they're getting over there. Because like truth be told, when I was out in Japan, during the cerveza sickness in 2020, that I call it the alcohol syndrome. It was interesting because the calls were very loud to do a copy and paste way of handling things, and I think that was very alarming in a good and a bad way. I think that was very alarming to a lot of people on all sides of the spectrum. Nobody thought that was normal, regardless of where you stood, right? And to be perfectly honest with you, nobody really got a break from when that happened, because we rolled immediately into Middle East and how we left that and how we left those things, and then boom, more war starts sparking, and then we can look kind of a 30,000 foot view on what's been happening there, and oh wow, they're making drones very cost effective, very cheap, surprisingly at a large scale in garages that are affecting the battlefield way more than we originally thought of. These are $100 drones. You're like, wait a minute, what's really going on here, right? But no one's got the ability to rest, and I can't help but ask, how do you put that oomph back into people when I think the masses, and debatably rightfully so, the masses, specifically in America, are worn out. They're just so tired of war all the time, and whether they're necessary or unnecessary, there is an element of fatigue that really has just taken a massive grip in America. And the question, that I would ask is, have we even faced our greatest foe yet? And if we're already tired now, how do we get people on board with that? God forbid, outside of some massive event, that jars everybody, to rally. Do you know what I'm saying by that?
Yeah,
Like some of
yeah,
our
yeah.
darkest times end up being the greatest moments of our lives because it shows the triumph within us. Like, how do we avoid those dark times in order to kind of spar these changes?
This is a great question. So a couple things I think of about this too, and I'll start with I was taught this by a mentor of mine, senior officer, and it's simple and it's awesome, and we would say it all the time, right? Is that yeah, at the end of the day, we are Americans, not Americans. We can, and this is we will. So that's one I'd say. The a couple things I think of this though. So let's talk philosophical for a minute, but it matters. Much of the last 20 to 25 years, even into the late 90s, but it really didn't start till after 9/11. Some will call that democratic peace theory. Democratic peace theory being like a kind of international relations theory that the idea was if we can institute these kind of like stable governments in these areas, then we won't have to deal with any kind of terrorist attacks or any kind of like negative things. And the reality is like democratic peace theory is at the core of how we operated in Iraq, how we are in Afghanistan, how we operate in Benghazi, how we operated in all kinds of areas. It really is. And it's noteworthy just to note that is a noble goal. I think it's probably worth reviewing in hindsight over 20 25 years. Like, is it actually that achievable? That's one thing. Where that leads you to,
You're referring to, in other words, nation building.
yeah,
That's
nation,
just
yeah,
to make
exactly,
sure. Okay, got it.
exactly, yeah, nation building, yeah, and the idea of like making these democracies, making these democracies. Again, a noble goal, a noble goal. I think it's worth looking at. We have real data now from 20 years of results, 20 25 years. Did it actually work? I think that is an unsettled question, and I think we have to have some clear-eyed discussions on that and think about this. That also means we developed a military system that was optimized for democratic peace theory.
Ah, that's okay.
Yes.
That's an interesting parallel. Yeah.
So you will not find anybody more desirable of peace and non-wartime than this old war dog who's been there, done that. And that's the reality. Like, there's nobody who wants that more. So the way I see constructing a military force now is no longer about optimizing it for nation building, democratic peace theory. I think we're optimizing something that is so violent and so dangerous that no one ever wants to ever have to use it. Those are two different goals. And I think that's kind of important. That's definitely what we are building, is that ladder. It's about deterrence. It's about strength, peace through strength, and that kind of deterrence. That I think that helps address the fatigue, because it is very different to be like, hey, let's do one more 90-day development on this cycle. We got to get into theater for this. We got to then do that. Like, that's not. It may end up that way. That's not what we want to build, and that's ultimately what we're not thinking about. We're thinking about building up capability that prevents us from ever having to do anything again. Much like again, the Manhattan Project, if you look at the pure numbers, since the Manhattan Project, it's an order of magnitude less humans have died in conflict. The reality is the advent of nuke weapons was one ushered in eras of peace, and I don't mean instability, but I mean just like numbers of humans that died in conflict, unprecedented in human history, unprecedented. I believe if we dominate autonomous systems the same way, we can usher in a yet another era and an even greater amount of more stability and less humans dying in conflict on any side, right? Less human suffering. So I actually believe that is kind of energizing when you think of it this way. This is also why we're passionately a dual use company. So, and I believe I believe actually in the dual use strategy, because then we're taking similar capabilities that both develop, weapon systems and national security capability, but it's also improving our day-to-day lives. Like our software, for example, improving drones that can get there faster after a hurricane or after a mudslide or after a wildfire. That actually matters to people. Like, And we have very real incidences in the last 12 months in the US where we did not have this kind of capability and we needed it. Within agriculture, the agriculture business had, during solar flare activity during 2024, they lost something like, I've been told by precision ag experts at the university level, something like $10 billion was lost. In
See what's crazy, but not to cut you off here, but the amount of people that probably didn't even know that that happened.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by like fatigue, right?
Yeah, right.
It's like they didn't even know
Right.
that they like that could have been way worse. That could have been fairly easily, because we're talking about a solar flare here. We're talking about something that we have zero human control over. That very well could have been 100 billion. 150 billion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now everyone is complaining about the price of eggs right now, but but that could have been a very sketchy situation really quickly, and you didn't even know that it happened in the first place. That's crazy to me. Sorry, please keep going. But just like fiat, that's like kind of mind blowing.
I think you're right. I know that almost no one knows that, what I just described. And I think you're totally right. And this, we're in the age of like, how do I silence the noise when it comes to information too? There's just so much information coming. How do we filter this? How do we, what algorithms are we training ourselves from? Whatever algorithm you're looking at, you're definitely programming your own brain. So that, that's all part of this as well. And this is all happening, it's all happening very fast. The way I think about it too, though, just another like common commentary is that, one, we're living in an age of unprecedented changes that we don't even realize they're happening so fast. That means, and this is where I would say to your first point about the fatigue, that is a like energizing call when you really wrap your brain around it that way. We're living in this age of unprecedented change. What that means is that there's all kinds of opportunities out there. This is truly the age of opportunity. A finance type would call it arbitrage, right? Arbitrage is like the golden, everybody wants to find arbitrage, within currency trading or something like that. The reality is the market is giving all kinds of arbitrages right now. All kinds of them. There's literally never been a better time to, whether it's start a business or to think creatively, to educate yourself on something, to experience some kind of personal, professional growth. There's never been a better time to do that in human history. Never. And it's only getting better. That part, I think, is actually quite energizing. And when we think of that, if we can, in my thinking of for autonomous systems, if we can dominate that, I see unlocking an era of human prosperity never before seen. Never before seen. That's also pretty energizing too. You're right to, is it that energizing to do another deployment to Iraq or Afghanistan for a lot of folks, and the U.S. populace just supporting that? Is that overly energizing? Maybe not. It might be necessary, might not be. Vigilance matters. But how do we also think about, okay, the effort we're putting into that is also something that can really improve our day-to-day lives in a way that has never been done, in a way that can address other issues that we have, right? We have, health crisis in many cases. We have, there's cancer that still has not been dealt with anywhere near how it should have been. There's, rising kind of obesity, rising levels of autism, declining birth rates. How do we address some of these things? Autonomous systems could actually give us the time and space and prosperity to address these as well. And that's the way I think about it. That and what we've seen, when I talk about this and when I talk about other folks working with us, I do think that can actually be quite energizing. So I agree with you on the general fatigue part, but I also think this is really a unique moment. It's a unique moment, and it's a chance for people to do things and be a part of something that really would go down in kind of the history books. This is a unique time that way. And I think for me and for the other folks that we were working with, that can actually be quite energizing.
So in terms of, give me something practical here. So so you saw the North Carolina, the hurricane, the flooding, right? Obviously the fires, you mentioned some natural disasters there. But and then same thing for Eastern Europe. So this is a very much so a parallel here. You pretty much saw the same thing both times, right? When networks went down, I think Elon was donating on, both in the war as well as in North Carolina. He was donating Starlink and a lot of things, right? But those Starlink, all that does is basically connect those puppet strings that you talked about
Exactly.
earlier, right? It
Exactly.
just
Yeah,
re-networks an
it is.
unnetworked area. Okay,
Yep.
so in practical terms, maybe I'm either getting it wrong or right here. You can walk me through it. Like, you wouldn't need, with what you guys have developed, you wouldn't really need to reestablish the network in order to do the connectivity to provide the change or the information or whatever. Your drones, your software, your systems don't need that. So they would need to be put and maybe programmed, or you'll have to tell me here, optimized properly the way what your naming convention was. But you guys can set them up, then deploy them, and then maybe they can be the ones to set the network up, or they can provide the food in the area without the network capability. Walk me through that.
Yeah, it's you're right on. Like it is, if we can unleash autonomous drones, give us to your point on something practical after a disaster, right? So now they can serve like really, it's, I mean, this is true. It's a myriad of functions they can serve. One of like very practical ones is that after disaster, you're on the clock, right? There's people that if they don't get saved within a certain amount of hours, you're not saving them. So time matters, and you're looking over like a broad area, And then what happens? Every disaster is like this, and I've been through enough crisis response to know that they all end up this way. So a disaster happens. There's all kinds of streams of information. Some is right, some is wrong. It's very confusing. It's chaotic. The first thing anybody needs to know is like, I need eyes on the ground. I need to understand like what's actually happening there so that I can vector the limited resources that we have, right? Because you only have so many people that can respond. You only have so much, whatever it is. It could be somebody, linemen to reestablish power. Power restoration is usually a big one after. It could be actual search and rescue folks. It could be delivering packages, but you only have so many of them. And there's usually very, very little, right? Because disasters, they don't often broadcast when they're going to happen. They just happen. So how do we respond to that? That's where, okay, well, there's one like basic one. I no longer have to wait for the Starlinks to get set up to then set into a drone. By then it's too late. It's way too late. It's way too late. So, our vision is that you have these kind of autonomous drones and, all over, especially like key high value areas, or hard to reach areas. It could be like a forest, could be near ports, could be in, different areas, maybe areas that are prone to flooding like North Carolina, other areas. And then, it happens, these become your first response. Then they don't need any strings anymore, like we talked about. So then they go out and they can capture this image. They can provide vectoring. They can also then, to your point, and this is a flexibility, maybe what we need is for them to establish the first network. Maybe that's actually what we need. So then they establish some kind of Wi-Fi mesh network, which we've done some R&D on that. And then you can provide that information back to the key decision maker in an operations center, working with FEMA, working with state types, who then can vector real resources to that point. Because the way it's done right now is, to be frank, like it's a lot of people sitting around hoping they try to figure out what happens. They wait till the storm is done, and then they have no idea what to do after that. They don't know. They don't know because they don't have any eyes on. They have no like way of understanding what's happening. So then what they have to do is say, well, we believe the storm went here from the radar. I'm just using a storm as an example. We believe it was in this area. So humans, let's get in trucks and let's try and drive there. And often they're wrong. Often that road is closed. Often it's actually impacted over in this area. And all of that time ends up getting wasted. And then hours turn to days, days turn to weeks, weeks turn to months, which is definitely what happened in North Carolina. And then real damage is done that could have been prevented had you had a better response. So that's one I think we see, really the disaster response one I think is really compelling to be able to do that autonomously. And then you're using these autonomous agents to tip and cue limited human resources and other resources, right? One use case that we've been working with some government agencies on is there's a train that kind of got derailed, and it was about a year ago, and it had like some kind of chemicals that it was carrying like sensitive toxic chemicals. Well, wouldn't it be great if you had an autonomous swarm that could go in there first before any human has to do it? And then you're sensing where the toxicity is for ppm 5 and some of these other like really nasty airbornes, because this sensitive chemical was disrupted. And then I can isolate that area. That's dynamic too, by the way. That air mass is moving. I can isolate that with a drone swarm, and then keep the few, because these are expensive sensors, there's not a lot of them, like these kind of like people response, they can go towards the highest impact area for those resources. And that translates into like massive cost saving, massive human life saving, makes the rebuilding phase much, much easier, much, much faster with, after this kind of incident. We see that as really like a powerful way to use this kind of tech in a, very meaningful, way to ultimately save lives.
Did you say that you can isolate the not the wind, but the windstorm by using those swarms of
Yeah,
drones, like
yeah. Like
through air currents? Is that what you
well,
mean?
one of the ways we've done some early kind of R&D in this is there's some very interesting sensors that they detect if you have this kind of element in the air, right? And we're teamed with a few different folks we've talked about with this kind of like an academic university lab kind of area. So if I could put that sensor on a drone, which I can, and that's actually pretty straightforward, and then that drone can autonomously, not needing any of the GPS and all the signals, and it can go detect that, and then that sensor becomes its navigation aid. So it autonomously stays with that air mass wherever it goes, right? So then no matter where the wind blows, literally, that drone stays there. And then that becomes like a beacon back as needed, or an awareness of, okay, this is where like the center of the most toxic air mass is in this area. And then we can, there's all kinds of things you do back to the operating center. Once you have that data, you can ingest that data into, I can model this, put it on a map. I can vector resources, and it'll kind of depend on the specifics of what the professionals want to do in that case. But that piece of data is actually critical for the disaster response.
That's wild, and that opens so many different doors in my head about the application, the very practical, very real application, right? I mean, I would assume the same thing could happen for fires. We just saw
100%.
LA.
Yep, 100%.
Not too long ago. Everyone seemed to have forgotten. Malibu is still, or not. Excuse me, not Malibu. Hawaii is still Maui. Maui is still struggling,
Yep.
and I think there's a lot of survey that needs to happen here with that as well. Are you guys primarily airborne drone activity, or do you guys do on the water as well, or?
Yeah, no, we started with air drones. What we found quickly is that the same basic components, GPUs, CPUs, inertial measurement units, digital compass, barometric pressure, are used in almost every domain. So on the surface of the ocean, subsurface, there's some differences, but there's a lot very similar on the subsurface environment, all kinds of airborne stuff, and then even low Earth orbit and even land. So we've actually found like the same basic operating of how you do localization is true for all of them. So we've got some pretty exciting integrations and kind of early pilots on all kinds of even non-drone, non-flying stuff on both the maritime space, the search and rescue space, the combat naval space, just like we just described. And the same basic technology problem set is what we're solving.
That's awesome. That's really awesome. I do want to ask, I think people, I know for me anyway, I'm smart enough to know I have no idea what the next 3 to 5 years looks like in terms of this technology age, the AI age, warfare looks like, and different things along those lines. But purely hypothetical, purely philosophical, like, what do you even see? I mean, at a certain point, any deployment of some of these softwares, or excuse me, some of these, yeah, well, it could be software, but some of these systems destroys everything, right? And that doesn't have to be like the whole earth blows up type thing, which is where I think most people envision. It's like if you just simply destroyed the internet, like not electricity, just the internet, the amount of peril that would happen worldwide is probably, unfathomable, right? What do you actually see a conflict looking like on that scale at that point between two superpowers in this modern age?
Yeah, this is a good question. One, I don't think it looks like what a lot of the war games look like. Um,
That sounds really important, by the way.
yeah, yeah.
If
I
we continue to war game out things that are irrelevant, that's not good.
What I think has happened in a lot of the war gaming, um, we're still taking kind of a military versus military approach, which is most definitely how it's not going to go. So I would harken it back to like, okay, let's think of like the nature of humans. Clausewitz talks about this a lot again, and not to oversight him, but I think it's useful in this context. And that this is a paraphrase, but the concept being that Clausewitz talks about this, how you have these kind of rational actors, right, and they are fighting over something. It's a piece of land, it's a ideology, it's a culture. Maybe they just don't trust each other, they don't like each other, whatever. They're fighting over something, and it's very rational at first. I'm thinking I have this much stuff, you have this much stuff. I'm going to try and target kind of this weakness that I think you have, and I'm hoping, I'm thinking that you're going to make this move, so I'm going to make this move, and it's very rational, right? And then what happens is somebody gets it's almost like a play fight, like you used to with your brothers or sisters, like you're growing up, right? And then somebody gets punched in the face, and they don't like it anymore. And then the ration goes out and it becomes emotional. It becomes, no, I actually want to hurt you. I feel wronged and I'm not going to stand for this anymore. So then a lot of these war plans and the logic and that starts to kind of fade away. And this is just part of human nature, right? And then it becomes that's on what Clausewitz talks. That's where you get to total warfare. Total warfare being all elements that I have that I can manipulate against you, I will, to coerce or compel the end that I want. And I'm blindly kind of doing this anymore because of how mad or hurt or perceived offended I am, right? Because we were play wrestling a little bit, not to make light of it, but we were play wrestling a little bit, and then somebody got punched in the face. And it escalates like that, and emotion starts to take over. So one, in God forbid, any kind of like major situation, emotions will be a part of it. So emotions will be a part on both sides. On both sides, they're very difficult to model. Very difficult to understand exactly how that's going to go. What I would say is a couple things is that our hyper-connected information age means that our emotions are much more contagious. So Metcalfe's law is actually like to the nth degree. In other words, if 10 influential people get really upset about the same thing very quickly on social media, all of a sudden 10 billion people might be like that. So that's a factor that I think we probably haven't fully wrestled with how that would work. And that's on both sides, by the way. So that would be an influence on this. So you have this kind of like, okay, I've got real military kinetic power, carrier strike groups, missiles, bombs, all this, kind of thing. Both, entities are aware of the massive destruction they will do to themselves if they get in a shooting war, right? The problem is you also have the irrational part that I just talked about, where they will become no longer aware of this because some kind of slight or something happened that now they are willing, and we've seen this throughout all of human history, they're willing to ignore ration and just fight because they're fighting. It's now an emotional thing. That's why this 3 to 5 year, it's actually I think it's very, very challenging. It's very kind of dangerous it's very, very difficult to understand what it would be and how it would go and that contagion. But what I could see is that we have the systems in place where emotional contagion could happen much, much faster. And I think that makes it much more difficult to model and kind of understand. The other one to understand factor is that both entities have both entities are enmeshed in each other's day-to-day lives in a way that's hard to even fathom already. Already. So there are factors that way that will manifest that's hard to kind of even model of what that would look like. It's hard to model what that would look like. All of that leads to, which none of that is, super predictive. All of that leads to a very dangerous situation that wargaming and rational thought will not model accurately. It also involves two entities that have access to each other and are kind of in a way like, they're woven into each other's fabric of their society in ways that they don't even realize. So those factors, which are a bit of a push and a pull, or maybe tugging on different sides, but they also could accelerate and push a conflict to a very different place very fast. All of that's a bit abstract to say that extremely difficult to know how that would go, which is why deterrence to me is much more predictable and where we need to focus our defense capability on. How do we deter? How do we deter that from happening? How do we deter that from happening in the next 3 to 5 years or 10 years, right? Like, how do we deter that? There's some like very elemental things. Deterrence has to be credible. Credible means that an enemy system has to know that should they cross some kind of a red line, everything they know and love and hold dear will turn to ash in front of their eyes. They have to believe that. That's real deterrence. So how do you make sure that that is clearly communicated and that is done? I think that's actually kind of the national policy, goal that we need to prevent any kind of conflict. And that goes back to like fundamental offering, fundamental like American values, like in the back of the US dollar, where you're offering peace but ready for war. So offering peace and cooperation, but ready for war should you cross some kind of red lines. That ready for war means that individual has to know and feel that both the political will and the technical capability is there to, again, hold everything they love and dear at risk. It's kind of a way of thinking of holding targets at risk. Holding target at risk goes back to really developed autonomous systems for all the reasons that we've talked about. And that's where I believe having these, the circle kind of goes to like having these really powerful autonomous systems ready to go is the way to prevent any of these high risk, emotional kind of conflicts that will happen that will be really difficult to predict because of the reasons we just talked about, of like how connected we already are and how emotional contagion can happen like that in a way that has never happened before. Use a historical thing. If Pearl Harbor happens now, the response is very different. I mean, there's an emotional response to Pearl Harbor to begin with, but imagine if you're watching that video on your social media, like you and I right now as we're talking, and stuff starts happening and you see the video, like that would be very emotional and it would compel different responses. 9/11, if the 9/11 attacks happen right now, 9/11 happened before the smartphone was really, at all in there. And it still had a very, there was emotion that was part of this. That happens now, the response is amplified. And that Clausewitzian emotional capacity, that will make it more powerful. It'll also make it harder to model and predict. And it will also be at war with the kind of the rational way of thinking. And it just will be. So I think that's all the more reason why we really have to focus on how do we deter anything like that from ever happening. Because once we start going down that path, the reality is I think it's going to be very difficult for either side to turn it off.
Yeah, and it's funny, and I'm going to ask this, and I do not mean this in the naive, the whole world is peaceful kind of question. I mean this in a much more deep way. But with how integrated everything is it even possible to have what we would even consider a war? Like fifth generational warfare, that's already happening. Exactly what you're talking about, the emotional contagion. So just take that and remove that out there. But in terms of like relatively speaking, traditional warfare, is that even possible with how integrated we are?
Yeah, I no, I think it's the right question, and the word traditional here is what I'll anchor on, and I would say no. And here's why. I'm going to say traditional probably means something that you've seen before, and so I'd say no. It is not something we've seen before. It is not. We've never went to war in the AI age. Never. Um, we've never went to war in the age of like autonomous systems at mass. What we saw was a small 40 million population country of that used it out of necessity and showed everybody like how powerful this is. We've never seen it at mass though, and all kinds of other stuff that we talked about. So no, I think at the nation state level, like that kind of war will never be repeated again. Like not the way we've thought about this, and it's actually I appreciate you asking that, because it's like it's good to announce that kind of like, or it's good to like verbalize that, is to just say like this will be something fundamentally different that the world has never seen. It will be, there's humans and machines that'll be part of this for sure. So it'll have human characteristics, but it'll be something very, very, very different, very, very different, and that makes it extremely hard to predict.
Kind of how they've been devaluing their currency to make things cheaper. And you go, why would we talked about this a little bit, right? Like, why would they want to do that? Because that makes their products cheaper, right? So believe it or not, people, the US does not want their dollar to be too strong. The US doesn't want the dollar to be overpoweringly strong. This is what started to happen with the Japanese yen, and we had to have a correction because then no one can actually import because they can't buy the materials. They can't, like, no one can actually afford to feed that economy. So there's a requirement for some form of balance, right? That is a byproduct of what globalization has done. Once again, just to repeat myself, those coal power plants are pointless if you don't have the coal that you import to run them. Now, I would not be surprised if they have overwhelming storage capacity for that in, long-term thinking. And I know we depleted our oil and blah, 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 and all that jazz. And there's more to it, but that's partly why I ask that question. Is like we're talking about 1, 2, 3 sectors. We're not talking about like all-encompassing how integrated every single thing is. I mean, what happens to the American university systems that have been getting funding? I'm not talking about the shadow funding. I'm talking about the public funding, right? What happens to biomedical research with the public funding? Like, what happens to hedge funds? It's not even a secret that Ray Dalio, I think it was in the 70s, he wrote in his book, Principles, which if you haven't read, I would highly recommend it. It's amazing. But he wrote in his book that he was using algorithms to predict markets in the 70s. And then he found human analysis combined with that robotic, just to go full circle here with what you were talking about, was better because there was always blind spots and missing. This is in the 70s. Now, this is also the same individual that helped build their financial infrastructure in a major, major way, right? None of this is a secret. It's in his book. Go read it. Go watch his interviews. He'll be pretty clear and open about it. I'm not making any, ghastly statements here. But it is something that I don't think people have even thought or thought about, other than, these drones in New Jersey, or talking about the Ukraine war. No one's really, thinking in these type of ways, and it's part of the reason why I was like, dude, I gotta have you on, I gotta connect with you, and I gotta hear your thoughts on some of this stuff. I do want to know though what your thoughts are, because you're the guy to ask about New Jersey and what that was, and now it's gone, and now it's and I don't want to go down the crazy rabbit hole or anything, but generally speaking, something was happening. It was either mass psychosis or something more.
I fielded this question a lot, but it's a good one. The one thing I would say is that here's the takeaway, and then I'll talk about a little bit just ways to think
Oh.
about it. The takeaway is this: the takeaway is that security is not two dimensional. So I believe that one of the policy takeaways from the New Jersey Jones situation, and I think a better clip, and this is a clip, and we can go look it up. There's a clip where I don't remember it was definitely after the New Jersey Jones situation was after the election. I may have been before the inauguration, sometime in that time frame. There's a clip where President-elect Trump was sitting with governors of states, and there was a good number of them, like 15 to 20 governors. And I think a reporter asked kind of a question about the New Jersey Jones situation. And there were, and this is not exaggerated, there was like 6 different governors that chimed in with very real frustration, saying we have reports of drones over our nuke plants, reports of over our bases. Like they actually chimed in and said, no, this is a real problem. It is not just New Jersey. So the takeaway that I think, the policy takeaway from that is that I think air monitoring is something that local law enforcement should 100% be doing. So the idea of like law enforcement just as two-dimensional security for you.
So outside of
Good
just
enough.
FAA.
Yep.
So more than the FAA, it's got to be local.
I 100% believe that. The FAA, that is, that 100% will not work. Every county sheriff, every city municipal law enforcement, every state level police force, I think they have an imperative to have both the use of drones, but also the ability to defend against any unidentified drone that were to penetrate, sensitive state, county, or city level infrastructure. This whole, I don't know, is not good enough. That is not good enough. And that's what happened. I mean, that's what happened. And that was a failure, to be frank. That was a failure of kind of governance. And I got to be very, very strong about that. So I think that's the takeaway here. The what actually is happening, what was being seen, right? So, I'll just deal in what I observed, right? And the clips that I saw, right? And some of these are verified, some of these aren't verified. There's all kinds of deep fakes and this, and there's definitely a phenomenon of, if you go to Salem, you will find witches. If you look up in the sky looking for crazy drones and aliens, you'll end up seeing them. And, so there is a phenomenon undoubtedly on this. There undoubtedly also was some very abnormal things happening. Both of those could be true simultaneous. So undoubtedly there was something like that happening. A couple things for some of the things I saw in some of the clips. You had overt lights on, like delta wing shapes and overt lights. Overt lights. I mean, it's something that's not trying to be hidden, right? First thing I did flying combat missions is turn the lights off. That's the first thing you do before you get into a combat environment. You don't want to be seen. So it definitely wants to, there's definitely a case where it wants to be seen. Abnormal how we saw them around so many sensitive sites. That could also be just availability bias, but it also, I think there was enough of these where we actually shut down airspace. The FAA shut down airspace. So that tells me, a couple of things. Either there's bureaucratic inefficiencies for airspace management, or the FAA was not aware of this. One of those two things has to be true. And we know that happened. Wright-Patterson definitely had impacts. Some other bases did too. So we know that's true. We see, you hear reports, and this is where I didn't see anything that was compelling one way or the other, but you hear reports of like some very abnormal kind of movements within the drones. That's where it's like, it's hard to say. What I would say is that things that fly in the air, it's hard to determine sometimes, what this is. So you can easily mistake something. So the other one being like, oh, these are just, U.S. military, we're testing our own weapons, we're doing this, that may be, that may not be. I don't have any unique insights on any of that. But, what I would say, which is, very open, and I think people understand this, that, we have all kinds of dedicated areas that are in the middle of nowhere to do this kind of testing. So, we typically do not do this kind of testing in, heavily populated areas because we don't want people to we don't want to draw attention to this. If it's truly like a secret capability, we probably don't want to draw attention to it. So, I would also say then that the technology amongst our adversaries is definitely at the level where they could fly things within U.S. airspace. And this is unfortunate but true. And we have a clear proof of this, right? We had a Chinese balloon in January 23 that basically, and it went at balloon speed. It basically crossed the entire U.S. before we finally scrambled a Raptor to shoot it down. Um, if that happened with one, it stands to reason that could have happened with other unidentified ones. Um, it also stands to reason that some of the response forces and monitoring forces are probably not where they should be. Hence the reason I'm very supportive of the Golden Dome initiative. So I put all that to say is that I think the takeaway, what it actually was, and or is in some cases, I think it's difficult to say. What I think is worth taking away is that air monitoring definitely has to be done at the local level. This is a new environment, and at the federal level, which is why you very much support the Golden Dome. And the drones and autonomous systems have really changed the way we think about things. It is, if everyone can have their own air force, and any small nation can build these and fly them at an area, and the FAA will go, I don't know what it is. It is a new way of thinking. It's a new way of thinking. So I also think that it's not good. I think this is part of the new way of living. Much like much like we've had to develop email filters because most of the emails we actually get are junk and are fake and are pseudo. We're rapidly approaching and we're starting in a world where at any point there'll be things flying over your head that you don't know what they are. You don't know where they came from. You know what they are. Could be friendly, could be benign, could be something much, much worse. And that's just the nature where we have to be, which is why I go back to we have to invest in the infrastructures to both monitor and interdict this kind of capability. And I think that's the lesson I take out of the New Jersey drones one. Is it really this idea of, hey, people are seeing something's definitely there. We're calling the FAA. FAA kind of goes like this. That's not good enough.
Yeah. I'm super curious. One more question here, and then I'm gonna let you go. Kind of a fork on that same kind of thought process. There is your autonomous drones. When a drone is truly autonomous, there's none of those links. What happens when they come across something that they don't know, they don't have the database or the information to adjust that, whether that is UAPs or whatever, or whether that's terrain, or just they've never experienced it before. How do they go about that and compute that?
Yeah, that's a good point. We started with solving what I would call deterministic problem, which is just to be able to fly from point A to point B without GPS, literally a straight line. So we started with solving that. The benefit of our approach, though, is that then the human gets to be involved with dynamic situation training. And the human then is involved with what effectively looks like policies. These are kind of the policies, because you're not going to be able to train it for every unique situation. It'll actually train itself. That's part of the autonomous machine learning that'll happen. But the human's involved with saying this is kind of the range of acceptable probabilities and outcomes. And then the human gets to use kind of their own unique crystallized intelligence in this environment. So in that way, and then I'll combine it with one other thing. When you're training in the simulator, then I can train it for 1,000,000x more things faster. So maybe it's never encountered this in real life, but that doesn't mean that over in the simulator it hasn't encountered something similar to this. And I can train on that because I can induce, and there's all kinds of folks working on this. Is actually a really growing market, is the market for synthetic training data. So I can use this, I can generate this synthetic training data, and then that synthetic training data will train it on situations that the human didn't even think about might happen. And we can train it to react in this, and then the human gets information. This is where the human learning comes in, of wow, I hadn't even thought that could be a scenario. What if we also added this policy? And there's this kind of iteration that happens in this case. So ultimately, it's about the kind of training that I think that happens, and that will be. This is as we're the Darwin poster, right? Of we're transitioning all the way up to the full human running, and we're in kind of the early as we're evolving this kind of intelligence in ways that we don't really fully understand or can even anticipate. that will be for these kind of like scenarios, and it will continue iterating in that. So the answer is right now it depends on what it was trained for. If it was trained just for deterministic, then it's just going to do deterministic actions. When we start introducing more dynamic situations, then it will use its own reasoning. It will use its own reasoning, but that reasoning will be governed by human policies that it was trained on. So it's sort of like this parallel is actually real. It's like, I'll flip that question back at you. Well, how do you know that your kid is going to live by the principles that you raised them for? The reality is you don't when they're out of the house.
Yeah.
You don't. So you train them when they are young. You instill your values and principles in them as a loving parent does, and then they go into the world autonomously. This is the same kind of thing that will happen in as we usher in the autonomous agent world, epoch.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, Jesse, thank you for hopping on with me. Unbelievable. If somebody by chance does listen, they want to invest, they want to reach out, where should they do so?
I appreciate that. So just hit me up at jesse@getvictus.ai. Jesse@getvictus, VICTUS.ai.
Perfect. And I'll make sure I have that in writing as well. So beautiful. Oh my gosh. Thought-provoking conversation. I think if you're not at least a little bit afraid of the conversation, you don't understand the scope of everything Jesse laid out and the current predicament we're in now. So I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you, man.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me on. This was awesome. I appreciate it.